Hello, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we are reading from the book Heidi by Johanna Spyri, and we're starting with Chapter 2, At Home with Grandfather. As soon as Detta had disappeared, the old man went back to his bench, and there he remained seated, staring at the ground without uttering a sound, while thick curls of smoke floated upward from his pipe. Heidi, meanwhile, was enjoying herself in her new surroundings. She looked about till she found a shed built against the hut where the goats were kept. She peeped in and saw that it was empty. She continued her search and presently came to the fir trees behind the hut. A strong breeze was blowing through them, and there was a rushing and roaring in their topmost branches. Heidi stood still and listened. The sound grew fainter, and she went on again to the farther corner of the hut, and so around to where her grandfather was sitting. Seeing that he was in exactly the same position as when she left him, she went and placed herself in front of him, and putting her hands behind her back, stood and gazed at him. Her grandfather looked up, but still the little girl continued to stand there without moving. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to see what you have inside the house," said Heidi. "Come then," said the grandfather, and he rose and led the way toward the hut. "Bring your bundle of clothes in with you," he told her as she was following. "I shan't want them any more," was her prompt answer. The old man turned and looked searchingly at the child, whose dark eyes were sparkling in delighted anticipation of what she was going to see inside. "She is certainly not wanting in intelligence," he murmured to himself. "And why shall you not want them any more?" he asked aloud. "Because I want to go about like the goats with their thin, light legs." "Well, you may do so if you like," said her grandfather, "but bring the things in. We must put them in the cupboard." Heidi did as she was told. The old man now opened the door, and Heidi stepped inside after him. She found herself in a good-sized room which covered the whole ground floor of the hut. A table and a chair were the only furniture. In one corner stood the grandfather's bed. In another was the hearth with a large kettle hanging above it, and on the farther side was the cupboard. The grandfather opened the cupboard door. Inside were his clothes, some hanging up, others, a couple of shirts and some socks and handkerchiefs, lying on a shelf. On a second shelf were some plates and cups and glasses, and on a higher one still, a round loaf, smoked meat, and cheese. Everything that Alm Uncle needed for his food and clothing was kept in this cupboard. Heidi ran quickly forward and thrust in her bundle of clothes as far back behind her grandfather's things as possible, so that they might not easily be found again. She then looked carefully round the room and asked, "Where am I to sleep, grandfather?" "Wherever you like," he answered. Heidi was delighted and began at once to examine all the nooks and corners to find out where it would be pleasantest to sleep. In the corner near her grandfather's bed she saw a short ladder against the wall. Up she climbed and found herself in the hayloft. There lay a large heap of fresh, sweet-smelling hay. Through a round window in the wall she could see right down the valley. "I shall sleep here, grandfather," she called down to him. "It's lovely up here. Come up and see how lovely it is." "Oh, I know all about it," he called in answer. "I am getting the bed ready now," she called down again as she went busily to and fro at her work. "But I shall want you to bring me up a sheet. You can't have a bed without a sheet to lie upon." "All right," said the grandfather. Excuse me. Presently he went to the cupboard, and after rummaging about inside for a few minutes, he drew out a long, coarse piece of stuff, which was all he had to do duty for a sheet. He carried it up to the loft, where he found that Heidi had already made a very good bed. She had put an extra heap of hay at one end for a pillow, and had so arranged it that, when she was in bed, she would be able to see comfortably out through the round window. "That is capital," said her grandfather. "Now we must put on the sheet, but wait a moment first." He went and brought another large bundle of hay to make the bed thicker, so that the child should not feel the hard floor under her. The two together now spread the sheet over the bed, and where it was too long or too broad, Heidi quickly tucked it in under the hay. It now looked as tidy and comfortable a bed as you could wish for, and Heidi stood gazing thoughtfully at her handiwork. "We have forgotten something now, grandfather," she said after a short silence. "What's that?" he asked. "A coverlet. When you go to bed, you have to creep in between the sheet and the coverlet." "Oh, that's the way, is it? But suppose I have no coverlet," said the old man. "Well, never mind, grandfather," said Heidi in a consoling tone of voice. "I can take some more hay to put over me," and she was turning quickly to get another armful from the heap when her grandfather stopped her. "Wait a moment," he said, and he climbed down the ladder again and went toward his bed. He returned to the loft with a thick, large sack made of linen, which he threw down, exclaiming, "There, that is better than hay, is it not?" Heidi began tugging away at the sack with all her little might, in her efforts to get it smooth and straight, but her small hands were not fitted for so heavy a job. Her grandfather came to her assistance, and when they spread it neatly over the bed, it all looked so warm and comfortable that Heidi stood gazing at it in delight. "That is a splendid coverlet," she said, "and the bed looks lovely. I wish it were night so that I might get inside it at once." "I think we might have something to eat first," said the grandfather. "What do you think?" Heidi, in the excitement of bed making, had forgotten everything else, but now when she began to think about food, she felt very hungry, for she had had nothing to eat since the piece of bread and a little cup of thin coffee that had been her breakfast early that morning before she had started on her long, hot journey. So she answered without hesitation, "Yes, I think so too." "Let us go down then, since we both think alike," said the old man, and he followed the child down the ladder. While the old man busied himself at the hearth, toasting a large piece of cheese, Heidi went back and forth to the cupboard. Presently the grandfather got up and came to the table with the jug and the cheese, and there he saw it already neatly laid with the round loaf and 2 plates and 2 knives, each in its right place. Heidi had taken exact note that morning of all that was in the cupboard, and she knew which things would be wanted for their meal. "Ah, that's right," said the grandfather. "I am glad to see that you have some ideas of your own, but there is still something missing." Heidi looked at the jug that was steaming away invitingly and ran quickly back to the cupboard. At first, she could see only a small bowl left on the shelf, but she was not long in perplexity, for a moment later she caught sight of 2 glasses further back. Without an instant's loss of time, she returned with these in the bowl and put them down on the table. "Good. I see you know how to set about things. But what will you do for a seat?" The grandfather himself was sitting in the only chair in the room. Heidi flew to the hearth and, dragging the 3-legged stool up to the table, sat down upon it. "Well, you have managed to find a seat for yourself, I see, only rather a low one, I am afraid," said the grandfather. "But you would not be tall enough to reach the table even if you sat in my chair. The first thing now, however, is to have something to eat, so come along." With that he stood up, filled the bowl with milk, and placing it on the chair, pushed it in front of Heidi on her little 3-legged stool, so that she now had a table to herself. Then he brought her a large slice of bread and a piece of the golden cheese and told her to eat. After this, he went and sat down on the corner of the table and began his own meal. Heidi lifted the bowl with both hands and drank without pause till it was empty, for she was thirsty after her long, hot journey. Then she drew a deep breath and put down the bowl. "Was the milk good?" asked her grandfather. "I never drank any so good before," answered Heidi. "Then you must have some more." The old man filled her bowl again to the brim and set it before her. The child looked the picture of content as she sat eating and drinking. When the meal was over, the grandfather went outside to put the goat shed in order. Heidi watched with interest while he first swept it out and then put fresh straw for the goats to sleep upon. Then he went to the little well shed, cut some long, round sticks and a small, round board. In this he bored some holes and stuck the sticks into them, and there, as if made by magic, was a 3-legged stool. Heidi stood and looked at it, speechless with astonishment. "What do you think that is?" asked her grandfather. "It's my stool, I know, because it is such a high one, and it was all made in a minute," said the child, still lost in wonder and admiration. "She understands what she sees. Her eyes are in the right place," remarked the grandfather to himself. The time passed happily till evening. Then the wind began to roar louder than ever through the old fir trees. Heidi listened with delight to the sound, and it filled her heart so full of gladness that she skipped and danced around the old trees as if some unheard of joy had come to her. The grandfather stood and watched her from the shed. Suddenly, a shrill whistle was heard. Heidi paused in her dancing, and the grandfather came out. Down from the heights above, the goats came springing one after another with Peter in their midst. Heidi sprang forward with a cry of joy and rushed among the flock, greeting first one and then another of her old friends of the morning. As they neared the hut, the goats stood still, and then 2 of their number, 2 beautiful, slender animals, one white and one brown, ran forward to where the grandfather was standing and began licking his hands. He was holding a little salt, which he always had ready for his goats on their return home. Peter disappeared with the remainder of his flock. Heidi tenderly stroked the two goats in turn, running first to one side of them and then the other, and jumping about in her glee. "Are they ours, grandfather? Are they both ours? Are you going to put them in the shed? Will they always stay with us?" Heidi's questions came tumbling out one after the other, so that her grandfather had only time to answer each of them with yes, yes. When the goats had finished licking up the salt, her grandfather told her to go and get her bowl and the bread. Heidi obeyed and was soon back again. The grandfather milked the white goat and filled Heidi's basin with the rich, warm milk. Now eat your supper," he said, handing her the bowl and the piece of bread, "and then go up to bed. Aunt Detta left another little bundle for you with a nightgown and other small things in it, which you will find at the bottom of the cupboard if you want them. I must go and shut up the goats, so be off and sleep well." "Good night, grandfather. Good night. What are their names, grandfather? What are their names?" she called after him. "The white one is named Little Swan, and the brown one Little Bear," he answered. "Good night, Little Swan. Good night, Little Bear," she called again at the top of her voice, for they were already inside the shed. Then she sat down on the seat and began to eat her supper, but the wind was so strong that it almost blew her away, so she finished hastily. Running indoors, she climbed up to her bed, where she was soon lying as sweetly and soundly asleep as any young princess on her couch of silk. Not long after, and while it was still twilight, the grandfather also went to bed, for he was up every morning at sunrise, and the sun came climbing up over the mountains at a very early hour during these summer months. The wind grew so violent during the night and blew in such gusts against the walls that the hut trembled and the old beams groaned and creaked. The wind came howling and wailing down the chimney like voices of those in pain, and it raged with such fury among the old fir trees that here and there a branch was snapped and fell. In the middle of the night the old man got up. "The child will be frightened," he murmured half aloud. He climbed the ladder and went and stood by Heidi's bed. Outside, the moon was struggling with the dark, fast-driving clouds, which at one moment left it clear and shining, and the next swept over it so that all again was dark. Just now the moonlight was falling through the round window straight onto Heidi's bed. She lay under the heavy coverlet, her cheeks rosy with sleep, her head peacefully resting on her little round arm. Her baby face wore a happy expression, as though she dreamed of something pleasant. The old man stood looking down on the sleeping child until the moon again disappeared behind the clouds, and he could see no more. Then he went back to bed. Chapter 3. Out with the Goats. Heidi was awakened early the next morning by a loud whistle. The sun was shining through the round window and falling in golden rays on her bed and on the large heap of hay, and as she opened her eyes, everything in the loft seemed gleaming with gold. She looked around her in astonishment and could not imagine for a while where she was. In a moment, however, she heard her grandfather's deep voice outside, and then she began to recall all that had happened. Heidi felt very happy as she remembered all the many new things that she had seen the day before and which she would see again that day. Above all, she thought with delight of the two goats. She jumped out of bed and dressed quickly. Then she climbed down the ladder and ran outside the hut. There stood Peter with his flock of goats. The grandfather was just bringing his two out of the shed to join the others. Heidi ran forward to wish good morning to him and the goats. "Do you want to go with them up to the mountains?" asked her grandfather. Nothing could have pleased Heidi better, and she jumped for joy in answer. While the little girl was bathing in a large tub which stood beside the door, the grandfather went inside the hut, calling to Peter to follow him and bring in his bag. Peter obeyed with astonishment and laid down the little bag which held his scanty dinner. Inside it, the old man put a large piece of bread and an equally large piece of cheese, which made Peter open his eyes, for each was twice the size of the portions which he had for his own dinner. "There. Now there is only the little bowl to add," said the grandfather. "You must milk 2 bowlfuls for Heidi when she has her dinner, for she is going with you and will remain with you till you return this evening. Take care she does not fall over any of the rocks. Do you hear?" The children started joyfully for the mountain. During the night the wind had blown away all the clouds. The dark blue sky was spreading overhead, and in its midst was the bright sun shining down on the green slopes of the mountain. Heidi went running hither and thither, shouting with delight, for here were whole patches of delicate red primroses, and there the blue gleam of the lovely gentians, while above them all laughed and nodded the golden rock roses. Enchanted with all this waving field of brightly colored flowers, Heidi forgot even Peter and the goats. She ran on in front of them off to the side, tempted first one way and then the other, as she caught sight of some bright spot of glowing red or yellow. And all the while she was picking whole handfuls of the flowers, which she put into her little apron. Peter had therefore to be on the alert, and his round eyes, which did not move very quickly, had more work than they could well imagine. For the goats were as lively as Heidi. They ran in all directions, and Peter had to follow, whistling and calling and swinging his stick to get all the runaways together again. "Where are you now, Heidi?" he called out somewhat crossly. "Here," called back a voice from somewhere. Peter could see no one, for Heidi was seated on the ground at the foot of a small hill thickly overgrown with sweet-smelling prunella. The whole air seemed filled with its fragrance, and Heidi thought she had never smelled anything so delicious. She sat surrounded by the flowers, drawing in deep breaths of the scented air. "Come along here," called Peter again. "You are not to fall over the rocks. Your grandfather gave orders that you were not to do so." "Where are the rocks?" asked Heidi without moving. "Up above, right up above. We have a long way to go yet, so come along. And on the topmost peak of all, the old bird of prey sits and croaks." That did it. Heidi immediately sprang to her feet and ran up to Peter with her apron full of flowers. "You have enough now," said the boy as they began climbing up again together. "You will stay here forever if you go on picking, and if you gather all the flowers now, there will be none for tomorrow." This last argument seemed a convincing one to Heidi, and moreover her apron was already so full that there was hardly room for another flower. So she now kept with Peter. The goats also became more orderly in their behavior, for they were beginning to smell the plants they loved that grew on the higher slopes, and they climbed up now without pause in their anxiety to reach them. The spot where Peter generally halted for his goats to pasture for the day lay at the foot of the high rocks, which were covered for some distance up by bushes and fir trees, beyond which rose their bare and rugged summits. On one side of the mountain the rock was split into deep clefts. The grandfather had had reason to warn Peter of danger. When they had climbed as far as the halting place, Peter unslung his bag and put it carefully in a little hollow of the ground, for he knew what the wind was like up there, and did not want to see his precious belongings sent rolling down the mountain by a sudden gust. Then he threw himself at full length on the warm ground, for he was tired after all his exertions. Heidi, meanwhile, unfastened her apron, and rolling it carefully round the flowers, laid it beside Peter's bag inside the hollow. She then sat down beside his outstretched figure and looked about her. The valley lay far below, bathed in the morning sun. In front of her rose a broad snowfield, high against the dark blue sky. To the left was a huge pile of rocks, on either side of which a bare, lofty peak that seemed to pierce the blue sky looked frowningly down upon her. Peter had fallen asleep, and the goats were climbing about among the bushes overhead. Heidi had never felt so happy in her life before. So the time went on, while to Heidi the mountains seemed to have faces, and to be looking down at her like old friends. Suddenly she heard a loud, harsh cry overhead, and lifting her eyes, she saw a bird, larger than any she had ever seen before, with great spreading wings, wheeling round and round in wide circles, and uttering a piercing, croaking kind of sound above her. "Peter, Peter, wake up!" called out Heidi. "See, the great bird is there! Look, look!" Peter got up on hearing her call, and together they sat and watched the bird, which rose higher and higher in the air, till it disappeared behind the gray mountain tops. "Where has it gone to?" asked Heidi. "Home to its nest," said Peter. "Is his home right up there? Oh, how nice to be up so high! Why does he make that noise?" "Because he can't help it," explained Peter. "Let us climb up there and see where his nest is," proposed Heidi. "Oh, oh, oh!" exclaimed Peter, his disapproval of Heidi's suggestion becoming more marked with each ejaculation. "Why, even the goats cannot climb so high as that. Besides, didn't Uncle say that you were not to fall over the rocks?" Peter now began suddenly whistling and calling, and one after the other the goats came springing down the rocks until they were all assembled on the green plateau. Heidi jumped up and ran in and out among them, for it was new to her to see the goats playing together like this, and her delight was beyond words as she joined in their frolics. Meanwhile, Peter had taken the bag out of the hollow and placed the pieces of bread and cheese on the ground in the shape of a square, the larger two on Heidi's side and the smaller on his own, for he knew exactly which were hers and which his. Then he took the little bowl and milked some delicious fresh milk into it from the white goat, and afterwards set the bowl in the middle of the square. He called Heidi to come, but she was so excited and amused at the capers and lively games of her new playfellows that she saw and heard nothing else. But Peter knew how to make himself heard. He shouted till the very rocks above echoed his voice, and at last Heidi appeared. When she saw the inviting lunch spread out upon the ground, she went skipping round it for joy. "Stop jumping about, it is time for dinner," said Peter. "Sit down now and begin." Heidi sat down. Is the milk for me?" she asked. "Yes," replied Peter, "and the 2 large pieces of bread and cheese are yours also, and when you have drunk up that milk, you are to have another bowlful from the white goat, and then it will be my turn." "And which do you get your milk from?" inquired Heidi. "From my own goat, the spotted one. But go on now with your dinner," said Peter. Heidi now took up the bowl and drank her milk, and as soon as she had put it down empty, Peter rose and filled it again for her. Then she broke off a piece of her bread and held out the remainder, which was still larger than Peter's own piece, together with a whole big slice of cheese, to her companion, saying, "You may have that. I have plenty." Peter looked at Heidi, unable to speak for astonishment. He hesitated a moment, for he could not believe that Heidi was in earnest. But she kept on holding out the bread and cheese, and as Peter still did not take it, she laid it down on his knees. He saw then that she really meant it. He seized the food, nodded his thanks and acceptance of her present, and then made a more splendid meal than he had known since he had become a goatherd. Heidi continued to watch the goats. "Tell me all their names," she said. Peter knew these by heart. He began, telling Heidi the name of each goat in turn as he pointed it out to her. Heidi listened with great attention, and it was not long before she could herself distinguish the goats from one another and could call each by name. There was the great Turk with his big horns, who was always trying to butt the others, so that most of them ran away when they saw him coming and would have nothing to do with their rough companion. Only Greenfinch, the slender, nimble little goat, was brave enough to face him and would make a rush at him 3 or 4 times in succession, so quickly and skillfully that the great Turk often stood still, quite astounded, not venturing to attack her again. Then there was little white Snowflake, who bleated in such a plaintive and beseeching manner that Heidi already had several times run to it and taken its head in her hands to comfort it. Just at this moment the pleading cry was heard again. Excuse me. Heidi ran to the little creature and, putting her arms round its neck, asked in a sympathetic voice, "What is it, little Snowflake? Why do you call like that, as if in trouble?" The goat pressed closer to Heidi in a confiding way and stopped bleating. Peter called out from where he was sitting, "She cries like that because the old goat is not with her. She was sold at Mayenfeld the day before yesterday, and so will not come up the mountain any more." "Who is the old goat?" called Heidi back. "Why, her mother, of course," was the answer. "Where is the grandmother?" called Heidi again. "She has none." "And the grandfather?" "She has none." "Oh, you poor Snowflake!" exclaimed Heidi, clasping the animal gently to her. "But do not cry like that any more. See now, I shall come up here with you every day, so that you will not be alone any more, and if you want anything, you have only to come to me." The young animal rubbed its head contentedly against Heidi's shoulder and no longer gave such plaintive bleats. Heidi had by this time found out a great many things about the goats. She had decided that by far the handsomest and best behaved of the goats were undoubtedly the 2 belonging to her grandfather. They carried themselves with a certain air of distinction and generally went their own way. They treated the great Turk with indifference and contempt. "Peter," Heidi said, "the prettiest of all the goats are Little Swan and Little Bear." "Yes, I know they are," was the answer. "Alm Uncle brushes them down and washes them and gives them salt, and he has the best shed for them." All of a sudden, Peter leaped to his feet and ran hastily after the goats. Heidi followed him as fast as she could, for she was too eager to know what had happened to stay behind. Peter dashed through the middle of the flock toward that side of the mountain where the rocks fell straight down to a great depth below, and where any thoughtless goat, if it went too near, might fall over and break all its legs. He had caught sight of the inquisitive Greenfinch taking leaps in that direction, and he was only just in time, for the animal had already sprung to the edge of the abyss. All Peter could do was to throw himself down and seize one of her hind legs. Greenfinch, thus taken by surprise, began bleating furiously, angry at being held so fast and prevented from continuing her trip of discovery. She struggled to get loose and tried so obstinately to leap forward that Peter shouted to Heidi to come and help him, for he could not get up and was afraid of pulling out the goat's leg altogether. Heidi had already run up, and she saw at once the danger both Peter and the animal were in. She quickly gathered a bunch of sweet-smelling leaves, and then, holding them under Greenfinch's nose, said coaxingly, "Come, come, Greenfinch, you must not be naughty. Look, you might fall down there and break your leg, and that would give you dreadful pain." The young animal turned quickly and began contentedly eating the leaves out of Heidi's hand. Meanwhile, Peter got on his feet again, and with Heidi's help led the goat back to safety. Peter, now that his goat was safe, lifted his stick in order to give her a good beating as punishment, and Greenfinch, seeing what was coming, shrank back in fear. But Heidi cried out, "No, no, Peter, you must not strike her. See how frightened she is." "She deserves it," growled Peter, and again lifted his stick. Then Heidi flung herself against him and cried indignantly, her dark eyes flashing. "You have no right to touch her. It will hurt her. Let her alone." Excuse me. Peter looked with surprise at the commanding little figure, and reluctantly he let his stick drop. "Well, I will let her off if you will give me some more of your cheese tomorrow," he said, for he was determined to have something to make up to him for his fright. "You shall have it all, tomorrow and every day. I do not want it," replied Heidi, giving ready consent to his demand. "And I will give you bread as well, a large piece such as you had today. But then you must promise never to beat Greenfinch or Snowflake or any of the goats." "All right," said Peter, "I don't care," which meant that he would agree to the bargain. The day had crept on toward its close, and now the sun was on the point of sinking out of sight behind the high mountains. Heidi sat down again on the ground and silently gazed at the blue bell-shaped flowers as they glistened in the evening sun, for a golden light lay on the grass and flowers, and the rocks above were beginning to shine and glow. All at once she sprang to her feet. "Peter! Peter! Everything is on fire! All the rocks are burning, and the great snow mountain and the sky! Oh, look! Look! The high rock up there is red with flame! Oh, the beautiful fiery snow! Stand up, Peter! See, the fire has reached the great bird's nest. Look at the rocks, look at the fir trees. Everything is on fire." "It is always like that," said Peter composedly, continuing to peel his stick, "but it is not really fire." "What is it?" cried Heidi as she ran back and forth to look first one side and then the other, for she felt she could not have enough of such a beautiful sight. "What is it, Peter? What is it?" she repeated. "It gets like that of itself," explained Peter. "Look! Look!" cried Heidi in fresh excitement. "Now they have turned all rose color. Look at that one covered with snow, and that one with the high-pointed rocks. What do you call them?" "Mountains have no names," he answered. "Oh, how beautiful! Look at the crimson snow! And up there on the rocks there are ever so many roses. Oh, now they are turning gray. Oh, now all the color has died away. It's all gone, Peter." And Heidi sat down on the ground, looking as distressed as if everything had really come to an end. "It will come again tomorrow," said Peter. "Get up, we must go home now." He whistled to his goats, and together they all started on their homeward way. "Is it like that every day? Shall we see it every day when we bring the goats up here?" asked Heidi, as she clambered down the mountain at Peter's side. "It is like that most days," he replied. "But will it be like that tomorrow for certain?" Heidi persisted. Yes, tomorrow for certain," Peter assured her. Heidi now felt quite happy again. Her little brain was so full of new impressions and new thoughts that she did not speak any more until they had reached the hut. The grandfather was sitting on a bench under the fir trees. Heidi ran up to him, followed by the white and brown goats, for they knew their own master and stall. Peter called after her, "Come with me again tomorrow. Good night." He was anxious for more than one reason that Heidi should go with him the next day. Heidi ran back quickly and gave Peter her hand, promising to go with him, and then making her way through the goats, she once more clasped Snowflake round the neck. Heidi returned to the fir trees. "Oh, grandfather," she cried, even before she had come up to him. "It was so beautiful. The fire and the roses on the rocks and the blue and yellow flowers, and look what I have brought you." And opening the apron that held flowers, she shook them all out at her grandfather's feet. But how changed the poor flowers were! Heidi hardly knew them again. They looked like dried bits of hay. Not a single flower cup stood open. "Oh, grandfather, what is the matter with them?" exclaimed Heidi in shocked surprise. "They were not like that this morning. Why do they look so now?" "They like to stand out there in the sun and not to be shut up in an apron," said her grandfather. "Then I will never gather any more. But, grandfather, why did the great bird go on croaking so?" she asked eagerly. "Go along now and get into your bath while I go and get some milk. When we are together at supper, I will tell you all about it." Heidi obeyed, and when she was sitting on her high stool before her milk bowl, with their grandfather beside her, she repeated her question. "He is mocking at the people who live down below in the villages because they all go huddling and gossiping together and encourage one another in evil talking and deeds. He calls out, 'If you would separate and each go your own way and come up here and live on a height as I do, it would be better for you.'" There was almost a wildness in the old man's voice as he spoke, so that Heidi seemed to hear the croaking of the bird again, even more distinctly. "Why haven't the mountains any names?" Heidi went on. "They have names," answered her grandfather, "and if you can describe them to me, I will tell you what they are called." Heidi described 2 of them to him, and her grandfather named them both. Then Heidi went on to give him an account of the whole day and of how delightful it had all been. She particularly described the fire that had burst out everywhere in the evening. The grandfather explained to her that it was the sun that did it. When he says good night to the mountains, he throws his most beautiful colors over them so that they may not forget him before he comes again the next day. Heidi was delighted with this explanation and could hardly wait for another day to come so that she might once more climb up with the goats and see how the sun bade good night to the mountains. But she had to go to bed first. All night she slept soundly on her bed of hay, dreaming of shining mountains with red roses all over them, where happy little Snowflake went leaping in and out. We'll stop there for today and start tomorrow with Chapter 4. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.